Where do the Dutch actually come from? It sounds like a simple question, but for more than 200 years, no one has been able to agree on the answer. Are they direct descendants of ancient Germanic tribes, the Batavians and Frisians who once stood face to face with the Roman Empire? Or something else is hidden beneath the surface? A much deeper story of migrations, mixing, and forgotten ancestors that quietly shaped the Netherlands over thousands of years. Historians have argued, linguists have debated. Entire ideas of Dutch identity have been built around this question. But today, DNA evidence is finally starting to give us real answers. And what it reveals is far more complex and far more surprising than anyone expected. In this video, we're going to trace the genetic story of the Dutch people, from the hunter-gatherers after the last ice age, through the Near Eastern farmers who brought agriculture, the steppe migrants who reshaped the continent, and a Bronze Age moment in the Low Countries that changed the genetic history of Britain and northwestern Europe forever. We'll look at where Dutch height really comes from, what the haplogroup data shows about the Dutch male lineage, and why Netherlands has become a fascinating case study in how a small country's population structure reflects both ancient migrations and recent history. The Netherlands today is home to about 18 million people in a country roughly the size of West Virginia. It is one of the most densely populated nations in the world, and one of the wealthiest per capita. Rotterdam is Europe's largest port. Amsterdam is a global financial and cultural center, and the country has a diaspora that once stretched across 6 continents during the Dutch Golden Age of the 17th century. Dutch colonies and trading posts shaped the genetic history of places as far apart as South Africa, Indonesia, New York, and the Caribbean. Afrikaans, spoken by millions in South Africa, is a daughter language of Dutch. The New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and New York accent still carries Dutch influence in certain place names. The Dutch left genetic and linguistic fingerprints across the planet. The Dutch are the tallest people on Earth, men averaging around 6 feet, women around 5 feet 7 inches. That's a full 20 centimeters taller than their ancestors were just 150 years ago. The story behind that height is a mix of genetics, diet, natural selection, and it connects directly to the ancient genetic story we're about to tell. To understand where the Dutch actually come from genetically, it helps to start with a geographical fact that most people don't know. And it's one of the most important facts in European prehistory. Dutch belongs to the West Germanic branch of the Indo-European language family, making it one of the closest living relatives of English. The two languages share so much vocabulary that Dutch speakers often find English surprisingly intuitive, and vice versa. German is another close cousin. The 3 languages together represent the heart of the West Germanic group. Like all Germanic languages, Dutch ultimately traces back to Proto-Indo-European, the ancient language family that originated on the Pontic steppe, the grasslands stretching across what is now Ukraine, southern Russia, and Kazakhstan. When the steppe herders moved west into Europe around 5,000 years ago, they brought their language. That language eventually diversified into the dozens of Indo-European tongues spoken across Europe today, including Dutch. But before we get to those steppe migrants, there's a crucial geographical context. During the last ice age, the area between Britain and the continent, what is now the North Sea, was not water. It was land. A vast, low-lying plain called Doggerland stretched from eastern England to Denmark, with rivers, marshes, forests, and wildlife. The ancestors of the Dutch lived here. They hunted its plains, fished its rivers, and built communities across a landscape now lying 30 to 40 meters under the North Sea. Between about 8,000 and 6,000 years ago, as the Ice Age glaciers continued melting, sea levels rose and gradually swallowed Doggerland. The people who had lived there retreated to higher ground, including the coastal areas. Researchers have found fragments of human bone on the Dutch coast, remains of people who lived in Doggerland and were left behind as their homeland sank. Geneticist Evelyn Altina, working with Harvard Medical School, has studied these remains, and what they revealed was striking. The earliest Dutch were dark-skinned and blue-eyed, not the blonde, fair-skinned image we associate with the Netherlands today. So, if the original Dutch were dark-skinned hunter-gatherers, how did the modern Dutch get here? The fair skin, blonde hair, and blue eyes associated with the Dutch are not as ancient as most people assume. The lighter pigmentation associated with Northern Europeans today arrived through two later migration waves. First, with Neolithic farmers from Anatolia around 7,500 years ago, who carried variants for lighter skin, and then more fully with the steppe migrants of the Bronze Age, who brought the KYTLG gene variant associated with blonde hair. Blue eyes had already been circulating among European hunter-gatherers for thousands of years. That mutation appears to trace to a single ancestor near the Black Sea region. Dutch height is a different and fascinating story. 2 centuries ago, the Dutch were actually shorter than many Europeans, shorter than the French and British. Average height for a Dutch man in the 1850s was around 5 feet 4 inches. Today, it's over 6 feet. That's a gain of roughly 20 centimeters in 150 years, one of the fastest increases in average height ever documented for any population. Most of that gain is environmental. Improved diet, particularly the Dutch tradition of heavy dairy consumption, better healthcare, reduced childhood disease, and more equal distribution of wealth all contributed. But a study published in the Proceedings of the Royal Society, led by Gert Stolp at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, found something additional. Taller Dutch men have more children on average. This suggests evolution happening in real time is also nudging the Dutch population upward. Then came the moment that changed everything. Around 2500 BC, the corded war culture, steppe-derived migrants from Central Eurasia moved into the Low Countries. This triggered the formation of what archaeologists call the Bell Beaker culture. The local population contributed about 13 to 18% of the Bell Beaker gene pool. The rest came from the steppe-connected corded ware migrants. DNA from the site of Oostwoud-Tuethorn in West Frisia, Netherlands, shows a near-identical genetic profile to the Bell Beaker migrants who flooded into Britain around 2500 BC and replaced up to 90% of the existing British population within a few centuries. The people who became the Bronze Age British, and by extension much of the genetic ancestry of modern British people, came from here. But for most of the 20th century, archaeologists argued this dramatic replacement story hadn't happened at all, and that debate matters for understanding how we think about Dutch identity today. For much of the 20th century, the dominant school of thought in European archaeology was skeptical of mass migration as an explanation for cultural change. The pots not people theory argued that new pottery styles, burial customs, and technologies spread because populations adopted them, not because new populations arrived. Under this view, the Dutch were essentially the descendants of the people who had always been there, continuously adapting to new cultural influences without major biological replacement. So what does the DNA evidence actually show about modern Dutch people? And what haplogroups define the Dutch male lineage? The most important recent study for understanding Dutch genetics is the February 2026 Nature paper, analyzing genome-wide data from 112 individuals who lived in the Low Countries between 8,500 and 1700 BC. This is the most detailed look at the prehistoric genetic history of the Netherlands ever published. Its central finding is something remarkable. The Low Countries were an exception to the standard European pattern of Neolithic replacement. Everywhere else, the Anatolian farmers who spread agriculture across Europe largely replaced the existing hunter-gatherer populations within a few centuries. In the Rhine-Meuse Delta region of the Netherlands, the hunter-gatherer population persisted at roughly 50% ancestry levels for 3,000 years, longer than anywhere else in Europe. They absorbed farming practices and farming women into their communities while maintaining their genetic distinctiveness. When the Bell-Beaker fusion happened around 2500 BC, the result was a population carrying roughly 13 to 18% of that ancient hunter-gatherer DNA, mixed with corded-ware steppe ancestry and Neolithic farmer ancestry. That Bell-Beaker population then drove the total replacement of Neolithic Britain. A second important study, published in Nature Communications, mapped the fine-scale genetic structure of the modern Netherlands using data from over 1,600 Dutch individuals. Led by researchers at Leiden University Medical Center, it identified 40 distinct haplotypic genetic clusters across the country, with a strong north-south variation. Northerners from Friesland tend to carry more hunter-gatherer and steppe-related ancestry, and are genetically the tallest subgroup in the Netherlands. Southerners from Limburg and North Brabant carry somewhat more Neolithic farmer ancestry and show genetic affinities with Belgian and German neighbors. This north-south divide is reinforced by the historical religious division between Protestant North and Catholic South, communities that tended to marry within their own religious group for centuries. A third study from Leiden University, published in Archaeological and Anthropological Sciences in 2025, analyzed the Y chromosomes of 348 men from 13 Dutch locations spanning 500 to 1850 CE. It found remarkable population stability across the medieval and early modern period, meaning the Dutch population from the early Middle Ages to the 19th century was genetically continuous. But this genetic picture doesn't sit in a neutral space. In the modern Netherlands, questions of ancestry and identity are live political issues, and DNA research keeps getting pulled into debates. The Netherlands has always had an interesting relationship with the concept of national identity. Unlike France or Germany, the Dutch national identity that crystallized in the 17th century was built less around ethnic ancestry, and more around a set of shared values: tolerance, pragmatism, and religious pluralism. The Dutch Republic was one of the first places in Europe where different religious communities could coexist, where Jewish refugees from Spain and Portugal found safety. In the 20th century, after World War II, the Netherlands had a substantial immigration experience. The decolonization of Indonesia and Suriname brought hundreds of thousands of people with Dutch citizenship to the Netherlands. Guest workers from Morocco and Turkey arrived in the 1960s and 1970s and largely stayed. By the early 21st century, debates about immigration, integration, and Dutch identity had become central to Dutch politics. When studies reveal that the original Dutch were themselves migrants from the Middle East and the Eurasian steppe, it doesn't settle those debates. If anything, it complicates the concept of what original even means. The Doggerland hunter-gatherers, who were the first inhabitants of the Low Countries, were themselves replaced. The Bell-Beaker people who came next were themselves a mixture of multiple groups. What the DNA does very clearly show is that the Netherlands has always been a place of arrival, mixing, and departure. The low-lying river delta at the mouth of the Rhine and Meuse has been a transit zone for human populations for 10,000 years. Every significant prehistoric migration in northwestern Europe passed through or was shaped by this region. So what is the clearest and honest summary of where the Dutch actually come from? Here is what the science currently tells us about the genetic origin of the Dutch people. Modern Dutch people are primarily descended from Bronze Age Bell-Beaker populations. That Bronze Age Bell-Beaker foundation explains the dominant R1b haplogroup, the West Germanic language, the steppe-derived predisposition for tall stature, and the fair skin, lighter coloring associated with Northern Europeans generally. Beneath that Bronze Age layer lie older genetic strata, the Neolithic farmer ancestry that persists especially in southern and central Dutch populations, and the Mesolithic hunter-gatherer ancestry that survived in the wetlands of the Rhine-Meuse Delta longer than anywhere else in Europe. That hunter-gatherer thread, dark-skinned, blue-eyed, ecologically adapted to the North Sea wetlands, is faint in modern Dutch genomes, but measurably present. It is the oldest indigenous Dutch ancestry there is. On top of all of this, The medieval and early modern periods added further contributions. The 2025 Leiden University Y chromosome study found that the Dutch population was remarkably stable from 500 to 1850 CE, with the genetic structure of medieval Dutch men largely continuous with that of modern Dutch men. But within that stability were local stories: the possible Jewish community in Eindhoven, the Protestant Catholic divide that reinforced regional genetic differences, the Huguenot and German immigration that added to the southern and eastern Dutch gene pool. And that is the genetic story of the Dutch as far as science has taken us so far. The 2026 Nature study is among the most recent and most significant findings about the Low Countries, and the field is moving fast. Leiden University, the University of Groningen, and their international partners are continuing to sequence ancient Dutch genomes, and every new find adds detail to this picture. If you found this video useful, please hit the like button. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people who love this kind of history. Subscribe for more videos on genetic origins, ancient migrations, and the deep human stories behind the nations we know today. And share this with anyone who has Dutch roots or an interest in the prehistory of Europe. If you have any questions or thoughts, leave them in the comments. Thanks for watching till the end, and goodbye for now.